She had nothing but a boy and a prayer. He had land, silence, and no one left to share it with. When their paths crossed by chance, what began as pity turned into a bond no storm could tear apart. The boy was barely 10 but stood in front of his mother like a soldier, back stiff, jaw set, his small hands balled into fists even though he had no fight left in him. His boots were too big, the laces frayed and trailing behind him in the dust, but he didn't stumble. Not once. Not even when his mother nearly collapsed behind him. Mary Alden had long stopped feeling the ache in her feet. Pain was a luxury, and luxuries had run out 2 counties ago. What she felt now was beyond pain, a coldness deep in her chest that told her she couldn't go another mile, yet somehow did. Her son, Jamie, hadn't asked for food in 2 days. That was worse than any pain, worse than any storm they'd crossed or any cruel eye they'd met in the last town. She would have sold everything she had if she had anything left. When they first saw the ranch, it didn't look like much. Just a split-rail fence, some rough-hewn stables, and a cabin with smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. But to Mary it looked like heaven, and to Jamie it looked like a place he might not have to sleep with one eye open. He turned to her, lips chapped, face drawn tight with more worry than a child should ever know, and said nothing. He didn't have to. Mary nodded. She adjusted her shawl, pulling it tighter across her shoulders, though it was threadbare and more holes than wool. She wiped her palms against her skirt and stepped forward, boots dragging in the dust. The front porch creaked under their weight. She raised her hand to knock, then paused. Pride clawed at her throat. She hated asking, hated the look that always followed, the one that measured her worth by the dirt on her hem or the thinness of her cheeks. But Jamie was watching, so she knocked. A long moment passed, then another. The door opened slowly. The man who stood in the doorway looked like the land itself, weathered, quiet, and carved by time. He was tall, with shoulders wide enough to block the wind, and eyes like storm clouds waiting to break. His name was Elias Hart, though Mary wouldn't know that yet. All she saw was a man who hadn't shaved in weeks, who wore sorrow like a second skin, and who looked just about as surprised to see them as they were to still be standing. "We don't want trouble," Mary said quickly before he could shut the door. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I got a boy, he's hungry, we don't ask for much." Elias didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to Jamie, then back to her. He said nothing, but the way his hand shifted on the doorknob made Mary's stomach turn. She braced for the door to close. But it didn't. "You got nothing?" Elias asked, voice low like it hadn't been used in days. Mary blinked, confused. "Nothing but your boy," he clarified. She nodded slowly. "That's right." He opened the door wider. "Then that's everything I need." Mary froze. For a moment she thought she hadn't heard him right, but Elias had already stepped back, gesturing them in. The warmth hit her like a slap. After so many cold nights in sheds and abandoned churchyards, it was too much. Jamie didn't wait. He stepped in like he belonged there, shoulders still squared, but eyes flicking around the room with caution. Mary followed, hesitating only a breath before crossing the threshold. The cabin was plain but clean. A fire burned steady in the hearth, casting soft gold over the wooden floors. There was no clutter, no noise, just the rhythm of the fire and the man who now stood watching them like he wasn't sure if they were real. Elias poured water from a kettle and slid it across the table. "Ain't much, but I'll fix you something warm." Mary whispered a thank you, fingers trembling around the tin cup. Jamie drank first, and when the first spoonful of stew hit his mouth, he closed his eyes and leaned into the heat like it was the first thing he'd ever truly tasted. Elias didn't talk much. Not then, he just listened. Mary told him pieces of the truth. That her husband had died in the spring. That she'd tried to work odd jobs but couldn't hold on to any long enough to buy them a roof. That the last place they'd been chased them out when Jamie coughed too loud in a general store. She left out the worst of it. The part where they'd slept behind a slaughterhouse for 3 nights. The part where she'd prayed someone would rob them, just so she'd have someone to beg. Elias didn't ask. Instead, after supper, he showed Jamie to a cot in the corner and told him it was his now. No strings, just warmth, just rest. Mary sat near the fire, her hands still wrapped around an empty cup, watching as her son fell asleep with his mouth open, and one hand clinging to the edge of the blanket like he couldn't believe it was real. "You'll need work," Elias said after a while, his voice rough but not unkind. "I can do anything," Mary said quickly. "I've done laundry, cleaned barns." "I didn't mean for me," Elias interrupted, shaking his head. "I meant for your heart. You've been carrying too much alone." Mary stared at him, unsure how to answer that. But he didn't wait for one. He just leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the hearth. The silence that followed wasn't cold or harsh. It was the kind of quiet that held room for sorrow, but also space for something else. Something Mary hadn't dared feel in months. Possibility. The next morning, Mary woke before the sun. Elias was already outside, chopping wood. She watched him from the window, arms rising and falling in a steady rhythm that seemed more prayer than labor. Jamie was still asleep, curled into the blanket like he never wanted to leave it again. By the time she stepped outside, the wind had picked up, tugging at her skirt. Elias didn't look up. "You're up early," she said, clearing her throat. "Old habits," he muttered. She picked up a stray piece of kindling and started stacking it. Elias didn't stop her. They worked in silence for a while before Elias spoke again. "Lost my wife 3 winters ago," he said simply. "Sickness took her. Ain't had a voice in this house since." Mary paused, hand hovering over the next log. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Weren't your fault," Elias said. They didn't talk about it more than that, but when Elias glanced at her again, his eyes were softer, less guarded. As the sun rose, the world beyond the ranch slowly came into view, bare hills, empty road, no one coming, no one chasing. For the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. But peace, like bread, runs out fast when you've known too many days without it. Late that afternoon, a rider came. He wasn't in a rush, didn't raise dust or shout, just came slow over the ridge, dark coat trailing, hat low over his brow. Elias spotted him first and stiffened. Mary stepped outside just in time to see Elias rest his hand near the rifle by the door. Jamie came up behind her, and she moved instinctively, shielding him with her arm. The rider stopped a few yards from the porch. He didn't dismount. "You Elias Hart?" the man asked, voice too smooth to be honest. Elias didn't move. "Who's asking?" The rider smiled. "Let's just say I'm here on behalf of a man who says you owe him something." Mary's blood ran cold. Jamie grabbed her skirt again. Elias stepped forward slowly. "I don't owe nobody," he said. "Not anymore." "That's so," the rider said. "Funny, he seems to think different." Mary looked from Elias to the rider and back again. The peace they'd found had lasted less than a day. She should have known. Peace was never free. The man on horseback didn't blink. His smile was thin, the kind that stretched across the face without ever reaching the eyes. He sat too comfortably in the saddle, one hand resting near his coat pocket like he didn't need to show the weapon he carried. It was enough for folks to know it was there. Elias' heart hadn't moved, not even to twitch. He stood with both boots firm on the porch plank, shoulders square, jaw locked tight. Mary had seen hardened men before, coal miners with broken knuckles, gamblers with crooked teeth and eyes that scanned exits. But Elias didn't look like a fighter. He looked like a man who'd learned how to carry weight too long and had decided the next man to add to it wasn't going to walk away smiling. "I said I don't owe nobody," Elias repeated, his voice even quiet. The rider turned his head and spit into the dirt. "Sure you don't." Then his eyes shifted, just barely, flicking to Mary and Jamie behind the door. "But maybe the boy does." Mary stiffened. Elias took one step off the porch. The sound of his boot hitting earth snapped the moment in two. The air thickened. A crow overhead let out a sharp cry and flew off like even it didn't want to witness what came next. "You finish that sentence," Elias said, his voice so low it barely rode the wind, "and I'll make sure your horse walks home without you." The rider smiled again, but it had less confidence now. He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folded sheet of parchment. He tossed it into the dirt near Elias' boots. "Letter," he said, "from a man named Sutton. Says he's got a deed with your signature on it. Says if you ain't got the land, he wants coin. And if you ain't got that," he nodded toward the cabin, "he'll take what you do have." Mary's breath caught. Jamie clung tighter to her. Elias didn't pick up the paper, didn't even look down at it. He stared straight at the man and said, "Tell Sutton I buried his debt with the last winter, and if he wants it dug up, he can come here himself." The rider shrugged. "Suit yourself, but Sutton don't forget, or forgive. Sooner or later he'll come collecting." He tugged the reins and turned the horse with a smooth pivot, riding off without another word. Only once the hoofbeats faded into the hills did Elias move again. He turned back toward the cabin slowly, the tension still thick around his shoulders. Mary stepped forward, voice tight. "Who's Sutton?" Elias didn't answer right away. He picked up the paper from the dirt, stared at it for a second, then crumpled it in his fist. "A mistake," he said, "from a long time ago." Mary waited for more, but nothing came. Inside, Jamie sat on the edge of the cot, silent. He hadn't flinched when the man mentioned him. That scared Mary more than if he had. Children weren't supposed to brace for threats like that. Elias closed the door behind him and tossed the paper into the fire. "He won't come back tonight," he said flatly, "but we ought to be ready anyway." "For what?" Mary asked. Elias met her eyes. "For someone who thinks what's yours can be taken." That night, Mary couldn't sleep. She lay on the floor near Jamie, staring at the shadows cast by the flickering hearth. Every gust of wind outside made her sit up. Every creak of the floorboards twisted her gut. She hated this. Hated the feeling of not knowing if she'd made her son safer or just put him in a different kind of danger. Elias didn't sleep either. He sat by the door, shotgun across his lap, hat tipped low, but his eyes never shut. Once, Mary thought he'd nodded off, but when she shifted on the floor, he looked up immediately. "Sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Ain't your fault the world don't know when to leave good people be." It was the closest he'd come to a compliment, and Mary felt it settle into her bones like warmth. By morning, nothing had happened. No riders. No noise. Just the soft gold of dawn stretching across the land, like the night hadn't tried to suffocate it. Mary stepped outside first, her shawl wrapped tight, boots crunching over frosted dirt. Elias was already out there, tending to the chickens like nothing had changed. Jamie came behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and said, "Can I help?" Elias handed him a small bucket. "They peck if you're slow," he warned. Jamie grinned for the first time in days. "I'm faster than chickens." Mary watched her son scatter feed and laugh as a hen chased him. She hadn't heard him laugh like that since before John died. Her husband hadn't been a bad man, just weak. The kind of man who disappeared when times got lean, promising he'd return with work, then never did. His body turned up weeks later, throat cut in a poker house dispute 3 counties away. She hadn't cried. Not then. Not when she buried him. Not when Jamie asked why they had to leave town before the preacher even said the final amen. Now, seeing her boy safe, even if only for a moment, she felt her eyes sting. Elias worked quietly, fixing fence rails, mending a gate hinge that had cracked in the wind. He didn't talk unless spoken to, but Mary found that comforting. She didn't have to fill space with words around him. He gave silence a kind of dignity. By noon, Mary found herself stirring a pot of stew, humming an old hymn her mother used to sing, and realized something strange. She wasn't afraid. Not like before. Even with the memory of the rider still sharp, even with the threat of Sutton hanging overhead like a dark cloud, there was something steady about Elias. Something that felt like shelter, not just from rain or cold or hunger, but from everything else that wore a person down. When they sat down to eat, Elias bowed his head. He didn't say much, just a quiet word of thanks. Mary glanced at him, surprised. She hadn't seen a man pray in years. After the meal, Jamie tugged on Elias' coat. "Can I see your shotgun?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I want to learn," Jamie said, eyes bright. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he rose and said, "Come on, we'll start with something smaller." Mary watched them disappear toward the barn, Jamie nearly skipping beside him. She felt the corners of her mouth lift. But the smile didn't last long. Just after dusk, a second rider came. This one didn't bother knocking. He rode straight up the front path, dismounted like he owned the dirt under his boots, and tied his horse to Elias' rail without permission. He was younger than the first, clean-shaven but cruel in the eyes, and he carried himself with the smugness of someone who'd never been told no. Mary stepped onto the porch. The man smiled at her. "Evening, miss. Don't suppose Elias' heart's around." Before she could answer, Elias stepped from behind the barn, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Jamie stood behind him, eyes wide. "Whatever you want," Elias said, "you're not getting it." The man clicked his tongue. "Shame. Sutton don't like being told no. He's getting real tired of sending messages." "Then maybe he should stop writing checks he can't cash," Elias snapped. The man's hand drifted toward his hip. Mary moved instinctively in front of Jamie. Elias raised the rifle. "Try it," he said. "See what happens." A long silence. Then the man chuckled and stepped back. "You got guts, Hart, but guts don't stop bullets. Sutton'll come, sooner than you think." He mounted his horse and rode off. Mary didn't breathe until he was out of sight. Elias lowered the rifle but didn't relax. "We need to talk," he said. Inside, he unrolled an old map across the table, pointed at a ridge to the north. "There's an old ranger's cabin there," he said. "Abandoned 10 years. If Sutton sends more men, this place won't hold. But that cabin's hidden, defensible." Mary studied the map, then looked at Jamie. "We'd have to leave tonight." Elias nodded. Mary met his eyes. "Then let's go." Outside, the wind had shifted. The night no longer felt quiet. It felt like something was watching. Waiting. They left before midnight, slipping into the dark like shadows escaping a fire. Mary carried only what she could pack in a satchel: blankets, food, a few stitched coins, a Bible worn soft at the edges. Elias carried the rest, but it was Jamie who bore the most. Not in weight, but in the way he never asked if this was forever. He just took his mother's hand and walked. Elias led them north through a shallow ravine that curled like a dry riverbed behind the ranch, hidden from the main trail. Above them, the sky was clear. Stars spread thick as dust over a table, but none of them dared admire it. Every crunch of boots in the frost sounded louder than it should have. Every owl call or rustle of dry brush set nerves twitching. They didn't speak. There was no need. The air itself felt hunted. The old ranger's cabin sat tucked beneath a cliffside, barely visible until they were almost upon it. It leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging with age, but the chimney was intact, and the walls looked like they'd hold at least one more storm. Elias pushed the door open with the butt of his rifle and stepped inside first, his silhouette tall and wide against the moonlight. When he didn't come rushing back out, Mary followed, Jamie clinging to her skirt. The air smelled of dust and mice, but it was dry. That was enough. Elias lit the lamp with a flint he pulled from his coat, the tiny flame licking shadows off the cabin's wooden bones. Inside, there was a table, 2 bunks, and a small stove set into a corner stone hearth. No signs of recent use. No boot tracks but their own. They were alone for now. Jamie sat on one of the bunks and pulled his knees to his chest, silent but alert. Mary placed her satchel near the wall and began unpacking, her hands moving by habit. She didn't need to be told what came next: kindling for the stove, blankets aired out, corners checked for leaks. Elias had disappeared outside to gather wood, and when he returned he brought a small bundle of dry pine, enough to last the night. Once the fire crackled and the air warmed slightly, they sat. No one ate. Hunger had become background noise. "What does Sutton want, Elias?" Mary asked finally. "The land." Elias sat forward slowly, his elbows on his knees. "It ain't the land." "Then what?" He was quiet a moment, staring into the flame like it might answer for him. "4 years ago," he said, "my brother took a loan from Sutton, tried to start his own spread. Big dreams, bigger than his back could carry. I told him not to, but he wouldn't hear it. Signed everything under my name so he could get the deed. Promised he'd pay it back inside a year." Mary waited. "He died 2 months in. Stampede. Left behind debt I didn't know was mine until Sutton came knocking." Mary's face tensed. "And you didn't pay it?" "I tried," Elias said. "Everything I had. Sold stock, tools, even my wedding ring. Wasn't enough. Sutton wanted more, said if I couldn't pay I'd owe him favors. I did one. Never again." The fire snapped sharply in the silence. "What kind of favor?" she asked quietly. Elias didn't look at her. "The kind a man don't talk about." Jamie's voice broke the hush. "Will he find us here?" Elias turned to him. "Maybe." Jamie nodded. "Then we fight." The room stilled. Mary reached for her son's hand, but Jamie pulled away, not in anger but in resolve. "We always run, Ma. I'm tired of running." Elias watched the boy, something hard and old flickering in his expression. He nodded slowly. "Then we teach you how not to." The next 3 days moved like smoke, quiet, drifting, but never still. Elias spent the morning scouting. He set traps, laid warning lines with small bells from his saddlebag, and marked paths to and from the ridge that offered sightlines on all sides. Jamie followed him like a shadow. Elias taught him how to watch for prints, how to feel for fresh horse sign in the soil, how to listen when the trees whispered more than just wind. Mary kept the inside warm. She fixed what she could, patched leaks with old fabric, scrubbed soot from the hearthstone, even whittled a small spoon for Jamie out of pine scrap. She wasn't a homemaker by choice anymore. She was one because it was the only way to keep her son breathing. At night they sat near the fire. Elias told stories, not loud or dramatic, just quiet memories, about his brother, about a dog he'd once owned that refused to come inside during storms, about the first time he saw the stars out west and thought they looked like holes punched in heaven's roof. Mary shared fewer stories, but when she did, Elias listened. She told him about the garden she once had, where Jamie used to chase frogs between the squash rows, about the way her husband smiled when he carved toys out of walnut wood, about how grief doesn't come in waves. It sits like stone at the bottom of the well, waiting for silence to echo. One night, as Jamie slept and the wind keened low outside, Elias looked at her and asked, "You ever think about staying? Long term, I mean." Mary blinked. "Here." He shrugged. "Or somewhere with me, with him." She didn't answer right away. The idea scared her more than Sutton, more than running. She was used to temporary, used to goodbye. "I don't know how to be permanent anymore," she admitted. Elias looked into the fire. "You don't have to know, just be willing." But peace is a glass floor. You don't see the crack until it's already beneath you. On the 4th night, the bells rang. 1, then 2, then silence. Elias was on his feet before Mary even sat up. He motioned for quiet, grabbed the rifle, and moved to the window. Jamie stirred but stayed silent, watching with wide eyes. Nothing. Then movement. A shadow crossed the far tree line, then another. 3 men. Elias motioned toward the back. "Out the rear, take the trail behind the cliff. Quiet." Mary hesitated. "What about you?" He didn't answer, just opened the door and slipped out into the dark. Mary grabbed Jamie's hand and the satchel and moved. Her heart thundered in her chest as they crept behind the cabin, feet barely making a sound on the frostbitten trail. But Jamie stopped. "Ma, he'll be alone." Mary crouched and cupped his face. "He's not alone. He's a storm in a quiet man's skin. You remember that. Now move." Behind them, a shot cracked the silence. Then another. Mary ran. Branches clawed at her dress. Jamie stumbled once, scraping his knee, but didn't cry out. They kept going, deeper into the woods, until the gunfire faded behind them. They stopped near an outcropping. Mary fell to her knees, breathless, pulling Jamie close. And then, footsteps. She turned, heart in her throat. It was Elias. Blood on his sleeve, a cut above his brow. But alive. "They're gone," he said, "for now." Mary launched forward, catching him before he collapsed. "They'll come again," he rasped. Mary nodded, tears burning her eyes. "Then we'll be ready." Elias met her gaze. "If I build it again, will you stay?" Mary didn't flinch this time. "Yes," she said, "we'll build it together." Elias bled slow. Not dangerously, not enough to take him down, but enough to leave red seeping into the sleeve of his coat, and to stain the promise that had just passed between them. Mary had never been good at stitching. She'd mended skirts and socks and seams her whole life, but skin was a different thread, and Elias never once flinched as she cleaned the cut on his temple or bound his shoulder with strips from an old petticoat. He just sat on a flat stone beside the outcropping, quiet as always, while the fire crackled in their makeshift camp, and Jamie leaned against his side as if he were already something permanent. They didn't speak much that night, not about the blood, not about the men, not even about the future. Elias stayed awake as he always did, watching the shadows stretch and shrink across the trees. Mary lay curled beside Jamie, one arm wrapped across his chest, her fingers never relaxing. She didn't sleep. She just rested with her eyes closed, listening for every footstep that never came, every twig that never snapped, waiting for the storm that had to come again. But dawn broke soft. Light spilled over the hills in thin gold fingers, brushing the tops of the trees and revealing the small cabin behind them, still intact. Elias rose first, stretching his back with a grunt as if it were just another chore day, not the aftermath of blood and gunfire. Mary stood beside him and said, "We need to go back." Elias didn't ask why, he just nodded. There was still food inside. Blankets, the map, tools, the things they'd need if they were to keep running or if they were to stay. The return to the cabin was cautious. They moved slow, rifles ready, eyes scanning every branch, every rustle. But no ambush came, no rider, no prints in the snow but their own. Elias stepped through the front door first. Inside, the fire had long since died, but the walls were untouched. A chair had tipped over in the rush, and one of Jamie's socks still lay balled near the hearth, but otherwise it was still their space. Mary entered next. She moved fast, gathering what they could carry into the satchel, rolling blankets tight, tying what food remained in cloth squares. Jamie hovered near the window, peering out with a kind of focus no child should have to learn so young. They didn't stay long. By mid-morning they were back at the outcropping, and by evening they'd found a deeper grove behind the ridge, a hollow surrounded by thick pine and rock, nearly invisible unless you stood within a few yards. It was there Elias decided to build. It wouldn't be a home yet, not for a long time, but it would be shelter. He chopped pine until sweat soaked his shirt. He stripped branches, carved pegs, dug frostbitten soil for post holes. Mary worked beside him, dragging limbs, sharpening tools, her skirt tucked at the waist to keep clear of the mud. Jamie hauled stones, his arms trembling but determined. By nightfall they'd raised a single wall, 4 posts, 2 crossbeams, and a rough lean-to roof made of pine boughs. It wasn't much, but it stood. The days after blurred into one another, thick with smoke, sweat, and the sound of nails being driven into wood. Elias worked like a man trying to outrun a deadline only he could see. Mary didn't ask questions anymore. She just kept pace. They built slow, intentional, a structure with a stove at its heart, not for warmth but for gathering. A space wide enough for three, tight enough to feel close when the winds came hard. They buried food in snowbanks, hung strips of venison from high branches, boiled water from the stream that ran cold but clean near the base of the cliff. And each night when the fire flickered and the work fell still, Elias sat near Jamie and showed him how to hold the rifle, not to shoot, not yet, but to know the weight of it, to understand that it wasn't a toy, that it ended things. One night after Jamie had curled up in the corner with his blanket, Elias said softly, "Boys got courage." Mary looked at her son. "He gets that from his father." Elias didn't look away from the fire. "I don't know much about God, but I believe he don't waste courage, not in times like these." Mary let the silence stretch before she whispered, "I hope you're right." But peace, as always, was brief. It came in the middle of the fourth night, a scream from Jamie's throat sharp enough to wake both adults. Mary was on her feet first, rushing to him where he kicked and thrashed in the corner. His eyes were wide but saw nothing, his fists pounding at ghosts that weren't there. "Jamie, Jamie, wake up." Elias came next, kneeling beside them, placing one firm hand on the boy's chest. Jamie gasped, sat bolt upright. His face was drenched with sweat. "They took you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Mama, they took you." Mary pulled him into her arms. "I'm right here." "It was a dream," Elias said, "nothing more." Jamie shook his head. "It felt real. I heard your voice. I tried to run, but the trees wouldn't move." Mary rocked him gently, humming low, her hand at the back of his head. And Elias just sat there, watching them both, the weight in his chest heavier than any rifle. The next morning, Jamie didn't want to eat. He walked slower, talked less. When Elias offered him a task, splitting kindling, the boy dropped the hatchet after 2 swings and didn't pick it up again. "He's scared," Mary said that night as they sat alone. "We all are," Elias replied. "But he's still a child." Elias glanced at her. "You say that like it's a comfort." Mary exhaled, long and low. "I just want him to feel safe." Elias turned his eyes back to the fire. "Then we give him something to believe in." The following morning, Elias dug into his satchel and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was worn, the spine cracked, but the pages inside were clean. He handed it to Jamie. "What's this?" "Blank pages," Elias said. "You ever want to remember something, write it down. Dreams, thoughts, fears, even the things you're scared to say out loud." Jamie opened the book and stared. "I ain't good at writing," he muttered. "You will be," Elias said. Mary watched from the doorway, her heart swelling, not with relief, not yet, but with something close. They spent the next week rebuilding, physically, yes, but also emotionally. Jamie began to smile again. Elias started carving, small animals, birds, a horse so fine it could have galloped off the shelf. He gave them to Jamie without ceremony, one by one, as if crafting pieces of a world the boy could hold on to. But Sutton hadn't forgotten. On the 10th day, smoke rose from the direction of Elias' old ranch. They spotted it from the ridge, black plumes curling into the sky like ink spilled across parchment. Elias didn't speak. He just stood there, one hand clenched at his side, eyes locked on the distant fire. "They're sending a message," Mary said quietly. Elias nodded. Jamie stepped beside him. "What do we do?" Elias looked down at him, then at Mary. And for the first time he said, "We fight." He returned to the cabin and pulled a trunk from beneath the floorboards, a hidden space built into the stone foundation. Inside were weapons, not just one rifle but 3, ammunition, a knife with a grip worn smooth, a pouch of coins, a map. Mary stared. You were ready. I hoped I wouldn't have to be, Elias said. They spent the rest of the day preparing. They dug shallow trenches near the edge of the grove, laid tripwire, set mirrors between trees to track movement. Jamie helped without complaint, his jaw tight, his eyes older than they should have been. That night they didn't sleep. And just before dawn, they heard the hooves. 6 horses, maybe 7, riders spread in a line fanning through the pines. Mary held Jamie close behind the first barricade. Elias knelt beside them, rifle steady, breath even. They won't take him, Mary whispered. No, Elias agreed, they won't. The riders slowed near the clearing. A voice called out. Elias Hart, you've had your warning. Elias stood. I'm done listening. And the clearing fell still. Like the world was holding its breath. The clearing remained quiet for 1 long second, then 2. Then all hell cracked open like a dry branch under boot. The first rider leaned forward and kicked his horse. The others followed, slow at first, then faster, 7 shadows thundering through the trees, rifles slung low, mouths twisted in sneers. But they weren't charging blind. They were circling, testing the ground, searching for weakness. They expected Elias to panic. They expected fear. What they didn't expect was the sharp crack of a rifle echoing through the trees, clean, precise, not panicked but calculated. One of the horses bucked sideways with a shriek, throwing its rider into the dirt where he didn't rise again. Elias didn't flinch. He had already reloaded, eyes narrowed, breath slow and steady as he fired again, striking another rider clean in the shoulder and sending him reeling. Then the woods exploded into chaos. Gunfire cracked back from the riders. Bark splintered near Elias' cover. Jamie cried out as a bullet struck the dirt inches from his boot, but Mary pulled him down behind the trench, covering his head with both arms, whispering prayers that barely reached her own ears. Elias stayed low, moving with the rhythm of someone who had done this before. He wasn't reckless. He waited, listened, and only fired when it counted. 2 more riders fell, one clutching his leg, the other screaming about ghosts in the trees. The rest pulled back just out of range, circling like wolves who tasted their own blood. But they didn't retreat. One voice called out through the smoke and haze, "You can't hold us forever, Hart." Elias stood enough to be seen. "Then you better kill me quick, 'cause the longer I stand, the more graves I dig." The answer came in more gunfire. Mary and Jamie crouched lower, pressed against the cold dirt. Jamie's hand clutched hers so tightly it hurt, but she didn't dare move. Her eyes locked on Elias, on the way he shielded them with his body without ever saying the words. And then it shifted. The riders stopped shooting. Elias frowned, crouching low, scanning the tree line. "They're waiting." "For what?" Mary asked. "For night or reinforcements." Mary's heart thundered. "Then we run." "No," Elias said, "we finish it here." Jamie looked up, pale and silent. "How?" Elias turned to them both. "We show them this family doesn't break." He returned to the trench, checking ammunition, then handed Mary a small pistol. "You ever shoot?" She nodded once, twice missed both. He looked at her seriously. "Then don't aim unless they're close. You aim to end it." Mary took the weapon, hands shaking. She de-held her son through hunger, walked barefoot through rain, watched a man die with his debts in her name. But this was war. The sun began to set. Shadows stretched long across the grove. The riders waited, pacing at the tree line, planning. At least 4 still moved. One had circled around. Elias was sure of it. He'd seen movement on the ridge. Maybe more were coming. Maybe this wasn't just about land anymore. Maybe it never was. As night fell, Elias leaned in toward Mary. "If I go down, take Jamie and run. Don't look back." Mary grabbed his wrist. "Don't say that." "It's not surrender," Elias said quietly. It's survival. That boy's got a future. So do you, Mary whispered. Their eyes locked. Then came the sound that changed everything. A second set of hooves, fast, sharp, not cautious like the rider's. A new horse tearing through the brush. Mary turned just in time to see a figure break through the trees from the west. A woman. Long coat, rifle strapped across her back, hair tied beneath a ragged hat. She rode straight into the clearing without flinching, ignoring the shouted warnings from the men. And she was smiling. One of the riders stepped forward, gun raised. "Who the hell are you?" She raised her hand and pointed toward Elias, looking for Hart. Elias stepped into view, rifle low. His voice was thick with disbelief. "Clara." She dismounted in one fluid motion. "Took you long enough to need me, old man." Elias exhaled, shaking his head. "I buried you 6 years ago." Clara grinned. "You buried the wrong woman." The riders stood dumbfounded, weapons still raised but no longer confident. Clara walked calmly to Elias' side, drew her rifle and cocked it. "You gonna introduce me to the woman and the boy?" she asked. "Or are we shooting first and hugging later?" Elias blinked, still trying to piece her presence into a reality that made sense. "Clara, this is Mary. That's Jamie." Clara nodded. "Good to meet you. Y'all shoot." Jamie opened his mouth, stunned. No, ma'am." "Well, we'll fix that later." A voice bellowed from the trees. "That's enough. We didn't come for a family reunion." Then a figure stepped out. A man in a fine coat, boots polished, gloves tight. His face was clean-shaven, his hair combed and slick. "Sutton." Mary knew him the second he smiled. "Now we're all acquainted," he said, raising his voice so it carried. "How about we make a deal?" Elias stepped forward, Clara beside him. "You brought guns. You're not here to talk." Sutton grinned. "I'm a businessman. You owe me, Elias, but I'm generous. Give me the land, walk away. Nobody else has to bleed." Clara snorted. "You think a man builds a home just to walk from it?" Sutton's eyes narrowed. "Then you choose blood." Elias raised his rifle. "I choose truth." Sutton pulled his glove off slowly. "So be it." The clearing snapped to life. Gunfire erupted. Elias ducked and rolled behind cover, Clara beside him, firing fast and sharp, dropping one of the riders with her second shot. Jamie and Mary stayed low, ducking behind the rock wall Elias had built 2 nights before. Sutton didn't fight. He stayed back, barking orders. But the fight turned quick. Clara moved like smoke, firing, vanishing, reappearing at a better angle. Elias covered her, taking down a man who tried to flank. One by one, the riders fell, until only Sutton remained. Elias stepped forward, gun raised. "It's done." Sutton laughed. "You think this ends it? I own the town. I own the law." Clara raised her rifle. "I ain't the law," she said, "and you ain't owed nothing." Sutton spat. "You'll never be free of me." But Elias didn't shoot. Jamie stepped out first. With the pistol. He pointed it with both hands, shaking but steady. "Leave." Sutton's smile faded. Elias stepped forward and placed a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "That's everything I need," he said quietly. Sutton looked between them, at the boy, at the woman behind him, at the man who'd refused to break. Then he turned and walked. They let him go. Clara lowered her rifle. "You always had a taste for mercy." Elias watched the retreating figure. Only when it means he has to live with what he lost. That night they didn't rebuild. They just sat by the fire. Together. Mary wrapped Jamie in a blanket, and for the first time in weeks, his hand didn't shake. Clara sat near the edge of the firelight, humming low, sharpening her knife like it was just another evening on the trail. Elias poured water into 3 cups. "To the house we haven't built yet," he said. Mary smiled. And the family we already have. The morning after the shootout came quiet but not peaceful. The sun broke late through thin clouds, weak and uncertain, as if it too had been shaken by what had unfolded in the grove. The clearing was still, a battlefield now littered with silence, broken branches, and the footprints of men who would not return to claim their threats. A grave had already been dug, shallow and unmarked, under the trees. Elias had said few words as he filled it, just a prayer spoken more like breath than language. Clara stood by without flinching. She'd seen worse. Mary kept Jamie close, away from the dirt, away from the sight of death. The boy didn't ask questions this time. They packed by mid-morning. The shelter, such as it was, had served its purpose, but the smoke from the fire, the scars in the dirt, the broken pine where blood had soaked, none of it felt like a place they could rest anymore. It wasn't fear that pushed them to leave. It was clarity. The kind that comes after violence has rung through the air like church bells. Elias stood in the doorway of the lean-to, watching the fire die out, and made the decision with a quiet nod. No one argued. "We head east," Clara said. "I passed a stream 2 days out. Fresh game, good cover, a better place to plant roots." Mary looked at Elias. He returned her gaze. "You ready to plant?" She took Jamie's hand. "I'm ready to stop running." So they walked. 4 people. No wagon, no horses anymore. Sutton's men had taken the last of them when they fled, but they walked with purpose. Clara took the lead, cutting through brush with a Bowie knife that gleamed every time it kissed sunlight. Jamie followed her like a second shadow. Mary and Elias took the rear, their pace steady, deliberate. There was no need to speak. The silence between them was full now. Not empty, threaded with a kind of understanding that only comes after you've seen each other in firelight, blood, and resolve. Jamie tired first, as expected, but never complained. He only glanced back at Mary once when the trail grew steep, and she smiled at him without words. That was enough to make him climb. By dusk they reached the ridge Clara had mentioned, and she hadn't exaggerated. It was quiet, eerily so, but not hostile. The trees opened into a wide basin, sheltered on 3 sides by high rock and thick pine, with a narrow stream cutting through the middle. Deer tracks marked the mud near the banks, and fish flicked shadows under the water's surface. Clara stopped and turned. "If they find us here," she said, "they earned it." Elias chuckled low. "I've lived in worse." Mary knelt by the stream and let the water run through her fingers. Jamie did the same beside her, his eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. For a moment, just a moment, he looked like a boy again, not a traveler, not a fugitive, just a child. They set up camp again, but this time it didn't feel like running. It felt like claiming. The next week unfolded like a new page. They built slower this time, not from panic but intention. Elias cut logs with methodical precision, stacking them not for shelter but for permanence. Clara scouted every ridge, every trail, and marked lines of sight with symbols Mary didn't recognize. Old military marks, probably. She never asked. Clara never explained. Mary started a garden. It was barely more than a patch of overturned earth at first, but she bent to it each morning with stubborn hope, planting seeds she'd carried in a pouch since her last town. Carrots, onions, even beans. The soil was rough, the light poor, but she tended it anyway. Jamie helped when he could, but mostly he wrote. That little leather journal Elias had given him became his lifeline. Each morning he sat near the stream, legs crossed, pencil in hand, brow furrowed like a scholar. He didn't always show them what he wrote, but sometimes he would leave pages out for Mary to find. Stories, mostly. About brave boys in cabins that never burned. About men who stood when everyone else ran. About women who didn't cry, even when the world tried to break them. One afternoon, as Elias was showing Jamie how to build a rabbit snare, Clara sat beside Mary near the edge of the grove, sharpening her knife on a flat stone. "He's good," Clara said, nodding toward Jamie. Mary smiled. "He deserves to be." Clara's gaze stayed fixed on the blade. "You know Sutton'll come again." Mary's smile faded. I know. He won't send men next time. He'll send law. Mary nodded. Then we'll be ready. Clara stopped sharpening. Elias won't let him touch either of you. I know, Mary said again. Clara turned to her. But will you let Elias keep holding the whole line, alone? The question hung between them like a swinging lantern. That night Mary sat beside Elias near the fire. Jamie had already gone to sleep. Clara was out on the ridge making her rounds. I've been thinking, Mary said. Elias didn't look up from the pot he was stirring. That's dangerous. I want to stay, not just here, she said, with you. He stopped stirring. I'm not the woman I used to be, Mary said. And you're not the man you were, but maybe that's the point. He didn't answer right away, just poured 2 cups of stew and handed her one. When he finally spoke, it was quiet. I ain't good with words. You don't need to be. I don't know what to call this, Elias said. It ain't charity, it ain't rescue. Mary smiled. It's family. Elias looked at her then, truly looked, and said, then let's build it. The next day, they started drawing up plans. Not for a shelter, not for a hiding place. A home. They marked ground for a barn. Jamie asked if they could have goats. Elias told him maybe. Mary began cutting old cloth to stitch curtains, humming to herself in a way she hadn't since before the world went wrong. Clara stayed, though she never said for how long. Long as there's breath left in my boots, she'd mutter, half joking, but they all knew it meant she wasn't leaving soon. Then came the letter. It arrived by writer. A boy no more than 15, rode up the trail with shaking hands and a paper tied with twine. Elias met him at the edge of the woods, rifle low but loaded. The boy handed it over. I was paid, didn't know what it said, swear it. Elias nodded, let the boy go. He brought the letter to the fire, set it down between them and unwrapped it. It was from Sutton. It was stamped with a seal, drawn with proper ink and phrasing, written like it came from a courtroom, not a coward. It said Elias' heart was now wanted for obstruction. It said harboring fugitives, Mary and Jamie, was a punishable offense. It said land ownership was void under unpaid debt. It said representatives of the territory would arrive in 3 weeks' time to remove them, forcibly if necessary. Mary felt her hands go cold. Jamie looked at Elias, waiting. Elias folded the letter carefully. We're not running, he said. Clara nodded. Mary took Jamie's hand. They had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks to dig in. 3 weeks to decide what kind of legacy they would leave, one of flight or one of fight. As the sun dropped behind the hills, Elias stood and said, tomorrow we build the fence higher. And after that, Mary asked. He looked at her, we build the walls thicker. Clara grinned, and when they come. Elias looked at the boy asleep in the corner, at the woman who still stood tall, at the fire they had lit from ashes. Then we make them wish they never came. The air changed when you knew a storm was coming. It didn't shout, it whispered. It quieted the birds, slowed the wind, tightened the skin across your knuckles even before the clouds appeared. The day after the letter arrived, that's how it felt in the hollow. Everything was too still. Even the fire cracked quieter. And yet they moved faster. By sunrise, Elias had mapped the entire perimeter. Jamie followed behind, helping measure distance between trees while Clara sharpened every blade they had, then buried half of them along the trail where boots might stray. Mary restitched their clothing, reinforced seams, patched what was thin and tore what was noisy. They spoke less, worked more, but in the quiet was rhythm, purpose. They weren't surviving anymore. They were preparing. And Jamie was changing. The boy who once hid behind his mother's skirt now kept a hand near his knife, not in fear but in readiness. He asked questions, about weapons, about laws, about justice. Elias answered as best he could. Mary filled the gaps with prayer and food, keeping his heart from hardening too fast. Clara taught him how to read terrain, how to notice a branch bent in the wrong direction, how to tell fresh prints from yesterday's lies. The days blurred. 1 week passed. Then another. They built walls, real ones, logs braced with stone and packed with earth. Clara taught Mary how to mix sap and ash for sealant. Elias dug a pit near the trail, filled it with sharp stakes and covered it with leaves. Jamie rigged a bell trap that clinked loud as a gunshot if triggered. They didn't talk about the letter again. They didn't need to. Every swing of the axe, every board nailed, every glance passed between Elias and Mary across the firelight said the same thing. We stay. The third week began with frost. They woke to find the ground stiff, water crusted with ice, and the air sharp as a blade. Mary stood outside their shelter, staring at the ridge, shawl pulled tight, hands clenched. She didn't need to say it. The time had come. Clara was the first to spot them. 4 riders, then 5. By sundown, 12 men had gathered near the south trail. They didn't approach, not yet, just waited. Mary counted uniforms among them, deputies. One man even wore a tin star on his chest like it meant something. But the man at the center wasn't Law. He was dressed in black again, gloves too tight, eyes like polished glass. Sutton. They'd sent his name on paper. But now he'd come in person. Elias didn't flinch. He stepped into the open, rifle slung low, gaze fixed ahead. Don't, Mary whispered, but Elias was already walking. He stopped just short of the clearing, where Sutton and his men waited like carrion around a kill. You made good time, Elias said. Sutton smiled. I've had a long time to think about how this ends. You brought Law, Elias gestured to the deputies. Sutton nodded. To make it clean, you're harboring a fugitive, refusing summons, sitting on land with debt 3 years cold. I'm just collecting what's owed. Elias shook his head. You're dressing revenge up in lawman's clothes. One of the deputies stepped forward. You gonna resist? No, Elias said. I'm gonna stand. Sutton's smile faltered. You think you're noble heart? No, Elias said. I think I'm tired of being afraid. Behind him, Clara emerged, rifle raised. Then Mary. Then Jamie. Then the firelight. The family wasn't hiding anymore. Sutton turned to the deputies. You see, armed resistance, that's grounds. Hold on, one deputy said, uneasy. This is a land dispute, not a war, we were told. You were told what he paid you to believe, Clara said, stepping forward. You see a man standing beside his wife and son. You want to be the man who shoots that down. The other deputies shifted. Some looked away. Sutton hissed. He's harboring a woman named Mary Alden. She's a known vagrant, she. I'm not a fugitive, Mary said, stepping forward. I'm a widow. My husband died owing nothing. The debts were his, not mine. Sutton used the law to steal what was left. I walked out with my son and my dignity. That's not a crime. Sutton's voice cracked. She ran from a ruling. There was no ruling, Elias growled. Just intimidation, threats, cowards with pens and guns. The deputies stood frozen. One of them dropped his hand from his holster. Sutton stepped back. They're lying. You're sweating, Clara said. Funny thing for a man with nothing to hide. Sutton's gaze darted from face to face. He saw what they saw now, 4 people who had nothing and everything. 4 people who had built a home from ash and dared anyone to take it. I can come back, Sutton hissed. No, Elias said, you won't. He raised the rifle slowly. Sutton's hand went to his coat. But Jamie was faster. He stepped in front of his mother. Gun pointed. Go, he said. Sutton stared. No one moved. And then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode. No fight. No gunfire. Just silence. He left his men behind. The deputies didn't follow. They stood there awkwardly until Elias lowered his rifle. "You gonna arrest us?" he asked. The lead deputy shook his head. "Don't see a crime here, just a man protecting his land." Mary stepped forward. "What about him?" The deputy sighed. "Sutton ain't the law, he just buys it sometimes, but he'll be watched now." They turned and left. The family stood in the clearing for a long time after the last hoofbeat faded. Then Jamie lowered his gun. His hands were shaking. Mary wrapped him in her arms. He didn't cry, not this time. Clara sat down on a stump and let out a long breath. "I thought we'd get shot for sure." Elias looked at them all. Then to the ground beneath his boots. "Still theirs." He turned to Mary. "We can start now," he said. Mary frowned. "Start what?" Elias looked at her, eyes soft, living. Spring came slow. The frost melted first on the rocks, then the soil. Buds formed on the edge of Mary's garden. A new fence went up higher, stronger. A barn followed. Then chickens. Then goats. Jamie named every one. Clara stayed until the lilacs bloomed. Then she rode east without goodbye, only a note left on the stump. "You don't need me anymore. That's how I know you're safe." Mary framed the note. Jamie's journal thickened with pages. Stories, songs, memories. Elias built a porch. On quiet evenings, Mary sat beside him while Jamie played near the stream, laughter echoing in a valley that had once only known silence. And on one such night, Elias turned to her and said, "I had nothing before you." Mary took his hand. "You still think I came with nothing?" she asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because now he had everything.